Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, literature, and popular culture. Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by producer and co-host Tracy Asteria. Tracy, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing great, Bruce. How's everything going with you today?
Good. Just had my daughter's graduation from high school, getting ready to go to college. So we've been busy with that. What's new on your end?
Not too much. We're celebrating homecoming here in the community that I live in. And it's been, a couple of days of interesting festivals. And tonight is the finale, and they're going to have some beautiful fireworks going on in about 2 hours or so.
What do you mean by homecoming?
It is a time, like I live in a really tiny community here in Nova Scotia, and the homecoming is basically one time every year when everybody from out west comes home, and it's just kind of like one big party. There's food and dancing, lots of music. It's pretty interesting. It's a nice time of year. And I'm not originally from here, so it's a pretty cool experience, not like the big cities for sure.
Now, nothing like that movie Dark Harvest where the people chase around the deadly scarecrow and have to catch him before midnight. Nothing like that happens.
Well, I'm not going to say for sure that doesn't happen because you just never know.
That was my favorite horror movie, or one of my favorite horror movies from last year. I really enjoyed that one. That was a good one. All right, very well, Tracy. Well, thank you for joining us once again. Today, our guest is prolific author Frank Saverio. Frank has written more than 50 novels in a number of different genres, including science fiction. One of his earlier books, called An Unlikely Phoenix, is a futuristic book about America in the year 2028. And his newest book, titled Kemper's House, came out earlier this year. Frank, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's so cool to have you here today, Frank. I personally think your background is super fascinating. You were in the military and later became a member of the Spokane Police Department. So I think that's pretty cool right there. Your writings include nonfiction and crime. So what made you want to delve into the world of science fiction?
I grew up on science fiction and fantasy, and a little bit of horror, I guess, where the three kind of meet.
Mm-hmm.
But when I finally got to the point where I was in a place in my life where I could really give writing a hard push. I've always been a writer, but it was always had to be second to whatever else I was doing to, make a living or finish school or whatever. It's never something I could focus on to the degree that it would be prolific to where I'd be producing a lot. And when that finally happened, I was 11 years on the job at that point. So what came out when I started writing stories was mostly crime fiction. And then, once I started down that path, I had a lot of stories to tell and a lot of different series to work on. And I never really thought about these other genres in terms of writing them for a number of years. But over the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's been a real itch that I've just finally decided to scratch. And I have to say it's pretty enjoyable to remember how exciting it was when I was very young to read these stories. And I've read consistently throughout my life. I've read sci-fi and fantasy, but to get to go play in those sandboxes, which are very different in a lot of ways than crime fiction.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's science fiction can take your mind absolutely anywhere. And that's one of the reasons why I love science fiction. You can just, anything is possible in that realm for sure. So I heard that you're a big fan of the author Philip K. Dick. What is one of your favorite books of his?
I like the stories that deal with, the way things might turn out. And he does that a lot. So Minority Report is really good. The Adjustment Bureau, I mean, he wrote, the story that Total Recall is based on, which is just a crazy ride of a movie. It's very different in the book, if I recall. But most of his work, I think that I've gravitated towards, the majority of it has been his short stories. Although, of course, Blade Runner was based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and I haven't read that in a very long time. I remember trying to read it when I was 15 maybe, shortly after the movie had come out and everything, and I couldn't keep up with it. It was so different than the movie, and it was so weird. I did go back and read it later, and it was still very different and very weird.
Oh my gosh. I wasn't aware of the actual author's name, but he wrote the novel Man in the High Castle.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't had a chance to read that, but that's definitely on my bucket list because I did see the Amazon series and I absolutely loved it. So, I wasn't aware that he wrote some of the books that you had mentioned too. So I'm going to have to add those to my list. So thank you.
Well, many of them are short stories, so you can get through several at a time in one sitting. That Man in the High Castle I thought that was just a fantastic series. And the book that Bruce mentioned in his introduction, An Unlikely Phoenix, owes a bit of a debt to that book in some ways.
Oh, awesome.
Frank, you mentioned that title, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is one of the stranger titles for a sci-fi book. And as you mentioned, it did become known as Blade Runner, regarded as one of the greatest science fiction films of all time. Is that a film that you're a big fan of?
Oh, absolutely. I love I like it when genres overlap. And so, that film is a good example of, science fiction and noir crime fiction overlapping. And in fact, the Venn diagram for that has a very big middle section. And so, yeah, I think it's a tremendous piece of work. And very, I mean, the cinematography, the way that Ridley Scott shot that film, the acting from Harrison Ford, the speech that Rutger Hauer gives near the end, much of which was he actually wrote parts of that speech, including the teardrops in the rain line. And I mean, it's kind of a dystopia noir setting, but it's science fiction, so. I love the way those clash, much in the same way, say, horror and science fiction overlap in Alien. I mean, there are a lot of elements of both genres. And I just, I don't, for some reason, I guess I like a little chocolate in my peanut butter where that's concerned.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've seen the original Blade Runner, which I think came out early 1980s. And for me, the performance of Rutger Hauer is really the standout performance. There's a lot of great performances, but his role in that movie, that's always the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, it was 82, I think, is when
82,
it came out.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure. And, I think you're bang on there. And the writing of that character, I mean, here you have a guy, I mean, he's an android, he's a replicant, but I mean, he's a sentient life form. And all he wants is what every sentient life form wants, to continue to live, and that's a very, I mean, you want to talk about high stakes. I mean, to the individual, those are the highest stakes. And I think it was a story that was ahead of its time. If you think about it, with the advent of AI today, and how interwoven into our daily life it is becoming, and does the danger exist of AI becoming self-aware? And if it becomes self-aware, do we count it as being a sentient life form? And if it is, then do we treat it the way we treat other sentient life forms? And which ones? I mean, cows are sentient life forms, and we don't treat them very well. And so that's the thing about science fiction that I love is it asks all of these questions by extension from the first question that it asks in the premise. And, but what about, ladder just goes up into the, to infinity. You just can keep climbing it because there's always another consideration. And that's one of the things that I find very appealing about it.
It's interesting that the adaptations by Philip K. Dick have seemingly done very well on film. Tracy mentioned Man in the High Castle. You mentioned Minority Report, Total Recall. Those are two excellent films. I'm talking about the Total Recall with Schwarzenegger as opposed to the more recent one. Why do you think it is that some science fiction writers, their works seem to translate well onto the screen? And then there are there's other great writers like Dean Koontz, and a lot of his books, for whatever reason, even though the books are great, they don't seem to do as well in movies. Is there something about the way that a Philip K. Dick wrote that just translate well? Or is there other factors?
I think there's two big factors. One rests with the writer. And there's really kind of two pieces of that prong, the writer prong. One is that the writer has created a premise that isn't a one-trick pony. It's a premise that does have those. It's a cool premise, but it has those. Well, yeah, but what about and if then what sort of tendrils that come off of it? It's not just wouldn't it be cool if this. And so that's part of it. And then the other part for the writer is that they've written interesting characters who are in a dilemma that is, while related to the premise, not necessarily perfectly aligned with the premise. If you think about Blade Runner, the premise being that, there are replicants who go rogue and have to be, these androids have to be destroyed in the future. That's kind of the premise, right? Mm-hmm. And Harrison Ford is a bounty hunter, a Blade Runner is what they call him. And he has to go kill these folks. But he's an interesting character. He falls in love with a replicant, and spoiler alert for a 1982 film. And then on top of that, the real question of that whole movie obviously is what is life and what is the value of that life? And he is struggling with that because of his love for for Rachel, the Sean Young character. And then there's the whole question of whether he may be a replicant himself. And so those are parallel to the premise, but they're not exactly parallel to the premise. They're an offshoot of it. So you have an interesting character who has a real conflict inside of a very interesting premise that isn't a one-trick pony sort of premise. And then the second piece, the other prong, is who's doing the adaptation. I think that adaptations are hard. They have to capture the essence of the source material, but they can't just, translate it one-to-one because it's a different medium. Mm-hmm. And so you brought up Dean R. Koontz. You could look at his peer, Stephen King, as well. There's some great Stephen King movies out there adapted from really good books. There's some pretty poor adaptations which are adapted from really good books where I think the author has kept up his prong with the premise being what it is and the character in the conflict and all the things that I described. But for whatever reason, the filmmaker or the person doing the adaptation hasn't been able to make that leap. And I think it comes down to they're focused too much on the premise and not on the core of the actual story. Is that making any sense, or does it just sound like
no, that does.
Pretentious third-year film student?
Well, it might be slightly pretentious. No, it's not. It does make sense. Absolutely. I understand what you're saying. There's only so much the writer can do, and certainly The director is a big part of it. Probably one of the biggest mistakes Stephen King made was when he tried to direct his own book, Maximum Overdrive. And he had no experience, and he was also heavily addicted to cocaine. And by his own admission, well, first of all, he didn't remember much about the movie. And second, he said, it's not very good because it was my own fault. I didn't know what I was doing. So I guess that might be one thing, too. If you're a writer, don't direct your own material.
Yeah, unless you're, like Michael Mann and you write for the screen.
Yeah.
But yeah, Stephen King made a good choice with that movie, and that was to use AC/DC music. I think
yes,
that fit the film really well. Outside of that,
yeah, that's a good point. Philip Dick wrote 44 novels in really a relatively short time. He passed away quite young. He was only 53. He died in 1982 as the result of a stroke. Is it somewhat remarkable to you that his influence remains so strong more than 40 years now after his death?
I mean, I think it's a remarkable feat. I'm not at all surprised by it, just because of the quality of the work, and there's one other piece to it too. I think not just the quality of the work, but I think I said before how he was ahead of his time a bit. With Blade Runner and the idea of artificial intelligence, he was kind of ahead of his time there. But here's a guy who in the 1970s was giving talks about simulation theory, and that didn't really start to become discussed, for at least another 20 years after that, and didn't get into the mainstream for, another 20 after that, So the guy was a generation easily ahead of his time in terms of thinking outside the box, and much of that comes out in his work. And so I think if a work is kind of timeless, and can transcend that 5 or 10 year time period to either side of it in which it was written, then I think it survives. It survives into the next generation and the next generation, and therefore the influence of the author and his or her work survives. I mean, I think that's why you're going to see, three people like us 100 years from now talking about the classics, and they're going to be talking about Stephen King and his work. I mean, I think it has that lasting piece to it, has that lasting quality.
I wanted to ask one other question about Philip K. Dick. Was he somebody that was plagued with bad health for much of his life?
I do not know.
Okay.
I do think he was plagued with some mental issues, whether that was depression or something else. I don't recall. And I'm not 100% on that. So
yeah.
Double check me if it's someplace better than Wikipedia. Better.
Yeah. It's just a shame we lost him at such a young age. He accomplished a lot, but how much more could he have done? As a writer, you're still in your prime, in your 50s and 60s, and we lost all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, like I said, he's, 20, 30, 40 years ahead of his time. If he was still writing in the, 2000, 2005, I mean, he'd be writing about stuff that we're not going to actually see for another 20 years from now. So I think you make an outstanding point there. And I think had he lived, he would have become one of the more outspoken folks on that subject of simulation theory, just because he was kind of the, I would say the kind of the grandfather of the idea.
There is so many good science fiction pieces out there, both on movies, TVs, and books. Do you have a favorite sci-fi movie in your collection or TV series that you love?
Favorite. That's a real tough one. I mean, I grew up on Star Trek. So definitely a Star Trek fan. And Star Trek's interesting because, it's mainstream and it's kind of soft science fiction, even though they talk about warp speed and they talk about, antimatter and that kind of stuff. It's all pretty fanciful. It's a space fantasy more than it is science fiction, right?
Right.
But I love it. I love the many different iterations of it. My wife and I just rewatched the 2004 reboot of Battlestar Galactica,
Oh,
um,
nice.
which that's one of my favorites as well. I like that one because of the stakes are so high. I mean, you're not just talking about individual lives; you're talking about the existence of the entire species, and 39,000 some people are all that live, all the humans left in the world, in the entire universe, for all we know. Those are some stakes, and
Absolutely.
so that's good. I liked James Cameron's films, both the Terminator 1 and 2 and Alien and Aliens
Right.
are really good. I'm not really an Avatar fan, but I like those other ones quite a bit. And then you mentioned The Man in the High Castle. I really enjoyed that. I'm watching Altered Carbon right now, the first season of that. And,
Oh, right.
so I'm fairly open to trying stuff. Going to check out The Expanse here later this year. It's been pretty highly recommended by
Mhm.
a few other sci-fi fans. So, but favorite, jeez, that's tough. That's tough. I don't think I can name one, to be honest with you. That's like, what's your favorite Stephen King book? What's your favorite uh, uh, ice cream? I mean, it's like, how do you pick your one?
Oh, exactly. I know, like, some of the, like, I don't know if you have seen Brad Wright's Travelers.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
science fiction, absolutely great. And then some of his other work, like the Stargate franchise. Like, I
Mhm.
don't know if you've seen that, but that was pretty
I,
good.
s-
But there's so many.
I saw the movie, Stargate movie. I really like that. I've got
Mhm.
Stargate on my radar for a watch, but I haven't watched it yet. I did really enjoy, both my wife and I watched Travelers, and
Nice.
I just thought that I love time travel when it's
Mhm.
not campy, when it's taken seriously, and they definitely
Right.
did take it seriously. Um, I mean, I was sad to see that series end, but I think they did a pretty good job of wrapping it up, as opposed to what you see sometimes these days, which is, cliffhanger ending and no renewal. So,
Yes. That's always a tragedy, actually. It's too much of that goes on these days.
definitely.
Frank, where I live here in Cooperstown, we have kind of a meetup every Sunday at a local coffee shop. And some of my friends are big into science fiction, and a movie that they really like, both in terms of the original and then the more recent film, is Dune. What are your thoughts on
Oh
that
yeah.
franchise, starting with the one from 1984?
Well, I mean, start with the book. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that book is absolutely a a classic, and I think a model that you could hold up in terms of world building, in terms of how to layer different concepts into a novel in a way that doesn't feel like you're info dumping and just giving a lecture on economics or ecology or politics or psychology. I mean, he was able to write a very compelling book on that delves deeply into all of those topics and others. And so I mean, I think Frank Herbert wrote a tremendous novel. Dave, here's the thing. I'm not a huge David Lynch fan. I know that's sacrilegious in some circles. I have a friend of mine who he's one of the hosts of the Beyond the Big Screen podcast, and I've guest hosted on there a few times. And he is a huge David Lynch fan. In fact, it's like a running joke that, how long does it take it to get to David Lynch mention? Doesn't matter what we're talking about. We could be talking about Pretty Woman, and David Lynch is going to come up at some point. And I'm not saying he's not a genius. I'm not saying his films aren't good. They just don't. It just don't appeal to me.
Yeah.
And so, and he directed that 84 film. But as David Lynch projects go, that's probably my favorite.
Hmm.
I think it's an interesting adaptation. The problem with a book like that is its scope of it is so huge, and you're going to try to drill that down into 2.5, even 3.5 hours. I mean, that's a real tough ask.
Yeah.
Some of those Philip K. Dick movies that we mentioned are based on short stories, and this is a deep layered novel, and you're going to try to knock it out in 2.5 hours. But I mean, I thought Kyle MacLachlan was believable as Paul. I thought the guy that played the Baron was good. And it definitely, I mean, I was glad they made it. I enjoyed it, but I mean, it does not even, I don't think it doesn't even hold a candle to the more recent adaptation. Even if you like allow for, if you control for the CGI capabilities, the effect capabilities. I mean, it's obviously not fair to compare 84 to 2024. I mean, there's, what is that? 40, 80 years of whatever it is, 40 years of advancement. But even if you, control for that, I still think it's a much truer adaptation. And I think what Denis Villeneuve did was what I mentioned earlier. He got to the core of what the story was about, and so it comes through better on the screen. So I'm with your friends. I really liked it.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned when you asked me before, another great one that I really, really liked was Interstellar. I liked that Matthew McConaughey one. That was really well done science fiction. I like that one a lot as well.
I haven't seen that one. Have you seen that, Tracy?
I have only seen the trailer for that movie, but I have like this long list of things to watch, and it's on there too.
Okay. All right.
It's definitely one to watch when you are like in I'm going to watch a movie I need to pay attention to sort of mood.
Yeah.
Good to know.
You got to concentrate on that one. Let's talk about some of your work, including your newest book, Frank. It is called Kemper's House. And just to clarify, for those who may not be aware, this has nothing to do with the serial killer, Edward Kemper. That's a totally different character. It's Captain Adrian Kemper, and it is a science fiction book. So give a sense of what that storyline is all about here.
Well, we're at an indeterminate point in our future, and humanity has mastered the ability to travel at 0.82 of light speed, which makes interstellar travel at least a little more possible than it is today. And around the time that they make this discovery and are trying to decide what to do with it, they intercept some radio waves from another sentient race about 300 light years away, much like we started sending out, radio waves, in the early 1940s and have continued to blast out into the universe with our noisemakers. Somebody else was doing that as well, and so humanity decides to launch a first contact mission to this planet called Kyra 2b in the Chiron system. It's 300 light years away, and so the ability to travel at 82% of light speed is coupled with some cryogenic technology so that that they can travel safely, and they do. Kemper puts together his team. They leave. They fly to the Chiron system, and I tried to be like not totally crazy about the science. I tried to be like, if you accept that they have developed a drive that can travel this fast, and if you accept that they can put people into a cryogenic chamber and sleep for a period of time, then the rest of the stuff is sort of close to realistic science. I mean, not like It's not going to hold up to a real scientist, but you're not going to be throwing things at the screen either, if you accept the premise. And one of the things that comes up when you travel is through space like that is the concept of time dilation, and how you may travel for 300 light years in a vessel, but it doesn't seem like 300 years to you. But when you get there, it's been almost 700 years back on Earth. This difficult concept of trying to, I mean, I had to draw a graph. I had to draw a picture, to a diagram to keep it straight as I was telling the story, because I didn't want to screw it up too terribly badly. So when they arrive, if let's just say it was 2100 when they left, if they arrive, to them it feels like 2400, but it's really 2695 back on Earth. And so this causes a little bit of a psychological impact. And it's also been almost 1,000 years for the people on that planet. The 300 years it took the lights to get to Earth in the first place, and then the time that it passed while they were traveling there too. So they get there and they are going to try to make contact with this alien species.
Now, I was going to ask you what time dilation is, and you've given me a pretty good explanation. Who came up with that concept? Do you know?
I think it's Einsteinian in its origins, but it's become a staple of theoretical physics these days. I consulted a physics professor that I'm friends with to make sure I wasn't totally crazy, and there's actually a lot of information online about it as well, including some. I actually could punch my numbers into to a little calculator, and the calculator would spit out, well, that takes 695 years on Earth, And so I didn't have to do the math myself. I actually found a place where you can punch in a time dilation calculator. So
really, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Tell us more about this character, Captain Adrian Kemper. Is he a heroic figure? Is he flawed, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, he's a very lonely character initially. Your parents are gone, no siblings, no extended family. That's part of the reason he was selected for the mission. He was a career military guy who had just retired when the Lightspeed discovery happened, and when they decided to put together this mission. And so he got the job. And in fact, all of the crew members were chosen because they didn't have close family relations, because of the psychological impact on, you go to sleep having said goodbye to your wife, and when you wake up, she's been dead for 650 years. I mean, that's a pretty big kick in the gut, right?
Yeah.
So they wanted to try to mitigate that a little bit. So I'd say he's a good man. He's not flawed in terms of character, but I think if anything, he's kind of incomplete. He had retired and bought a little house in Ireland, a little stone cottage, and was kind of just lonely and didn't know what to do with the rest of his life. And then this mission came along, and so he dedicated himself to that. I think all of the members of the crew end up being heroic based on how they handle events. And maybe that's one of the things I like about storytelling, is that often it's not necessarily that the person is an heroic person. It's that, he or she is faced with a situation and they behave heroically, and then we label them as a hero, but they're the same person as they were before they, did this affirming act that makes us call them a hero. So that's just another one of those, but what about sort of questions that comes up when you're working on something like this.
Yeah. I'm really impressed by sci-fi writers. Their creativity level is just off the charts. How do you come up with an idea like this?
Well, I think a few things came together for me. One was, I'm 55 years old, and the world is changing around me in ways that I don't always understand or think should be happening. And I don't mean to sound like, old man shakes fists at clouds sort of thing, but when you look at folks that are in their 20s now, their way of seeing the world is just radically different than mine is. And I don't even mean, left or right politics or anything like that. I just mean, just their general outlook on the world, on why we're here, how we should interact, what is normal, what is right. And and so I was feeling a little unsettled about that, and I kind of noticed that I was feeling a little unsettled, and so that's the deep, dark, dirty secret about this book that I really don't tell many people, is just that that was one of the genesis for it, was to try to put a character into that situation, and I realized that if somebody made a trip in space and then came back, they'd come back, 1,200, 1,500 years after they left, they'd be a man out of place. They'd be a woman out of time. And that idea was fascinating to me. And so I wanted to explore it. And it kind of took off from there. And then I started thinking about the idea of first contact. I started thinking about the idea of how our civilizations are not as stable as we think they are. My undergraduate degree was in history, and I'm a kind of a history nerd, and like a lot of people, Rome is one of the things on my list that I'm fascinated by. And if you think about the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire in particular, I mean, people put the date at different times, but 476 is a pretty popular one. On the day after the last Roman emperor was deposed, and the Ostrogoth leader took control of, made himself king of Italy, was life any different for somebody living in Milan, selling fish or keeping a shop or tilling a field? It really wasn't. It didn't really change, but over time it did, and a lot was lost. And I was struck by, for instance, if you look at English history, the island of, the southern part of Great Britain there, the English section, and the back and forth there where, you had the Britons, and then the Romans came in and they conquered part of it, and they built villas, and they built aqueducts, and they from their perspective, they civilized a lot of at least the city centers, and then they left, and things fell into ruin. And the Britons kind of came back in, but they were mixed with the Romans, and so they weren't really the same people anymore. And then boom, here come the Saxons, and they start taking over. And then a little while after that, a few hundred years, but then the Vikings show up and take over big chunks of it, and then the Normans invade in 1066. And in each of these instances, you kind of had a civilization or part of one sort of rise up to prominence, and then for one reason or another either fall or be battered down. And these things are impermanent. And then throw on top of that the idea of whose land is it anyway? I mean, if you look at the scenario I just painted, who has a right to that land? The original Britons who were there? Are there any of them left? Should it be the Saxons who took it from after the Romans left? Or, is it the Vikings who got it by right of conquest, or since they eventually lost to the Normans? Is it in the right hands that it should be? I mean, and how long do you have to be in a place that you've just now settled and taken over before you're a native to it, before it's yours? You have that, these are the kinds of questions that were going around in my mind. And so I wanted to work them into the book, and at least ask the question, even if I couldn't a satisfactory answer. Often good literature and good films will do a really good job of posing the question, maybe having a few characters give their answers, but not necessarily giving a definitive one for the reader or the viewer to have to accept as the answer. They get to come up with what they think the answer might be.
Frank, one final question on Kemper's House. The book is not a horror story, but there are some suspenseful, some scary moments. Tell us about the woods.
So it's a little bit of a spoiler, but when they get to the planet, they do have some difficulty making contact with the race that is there, the Chirons. And actually, there are three separate species of the chirons that live on this planet at the same time. So it'd be like if Neanderthals and Denisovans were still around and we coexisted with them, that kind of a scenario. And so as they're trying to find these, one of the species to talk to, they eventually end up in a deserted village, and some creatures show up in the night, and they see their eyes out in the woods, and then the eyes disappear, and then there's this real tense standoff where they're waiting to see what's going to happen. And that was born of this idea of how dark it really is when it's dark. I mean, people who never leave the city or have never gone out into the woods at night or away from civilization and been there at night without, your headlights or your flashlight or your campfire. That's what our ancestors meant when they said dark. That's why they believed in the things that they believed in, because it's very, very dark and it's very scary. And I wanted to put these folks kind of up against that. Even though they have some technology, they're still, it's still a frightening obstacle for them to have to face. These frightening yellow eyes staring back at them with intelligence, dotted throughout the woods, just outside of the light of the fire that's flickering. Believe me, a few more logs went on the fire right after that.
That sounds like such a fascinating book. I have a question. Do you also do audiobooks? You have a really great voice. And I was wondering, do you narrate audiobooks for your writings?
I've narrated some of the short stories that I've done. Some of the collections that I've put out. One of them I narrated almost all of the stories. And then on some of the others, I narrated selected ones. And I appreciate the compliment. Thank you. That's very kind of you. And if you're correct, and I do have a good voice for that sort of thing, I still don't have the acting talent that an actual narrator has. And when I hear, I'll hear, I'll narrate a story and then I'll hear it, I'll be like, wow, that turned out pretty good. And then the next story on the book will be by a professional narrator that I hired. And I'll be like, oh, that's like me doing a slap shot and then Sidney Crosby doing a slap shot. I see the difference now. There's an audiobook version of Kemper's House in production right now. But I'm using a UK actor named Jacob Daniels. So I feel like sometimes science fiction can benefit from that UK accent, and looking forward to hearing what he does with it.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Oh, wow. Given all of the experience that you have as an author, what kind of advice would you give to a new budding author in the industry?
Well, I think that's a huge question. That's like a 2-hour answer. So I'll give you the 20-second one. Know why you're doing it, because if you're doing it for financial reasons, then focus on that. Focus on the marketing, focus on everything to do with how to financially profit from writing. If you're doing it for artistic and expression reasons, then make sure that's always on the forefront of your mind, and don't let yourself be discouraged if you're selling, 1 copy a week and not 1 million copies a week. And so I think that's a huge piece of advice. I'll give you 2 others. Read. That's one. If you read, it's like push-ups for your writer's brain. You soak things in. It's teaching yourself how to write by osmosis. I can't think, I struggle to think how someone could be a writer of fiction in particular and not read prolifically. So read more than you think you need to. And then, this is going to sound very simple, but focus on the craft, learn the craft. And that doesn't necessarily mean follow what everybody else says, because you are going to develop your own style and you're going to develop your own sensibility. But like anything else, you learn what the rules are, and once you understand the rules, then you can understand why it is that you're breaking them, and that's fine that you break them, but know what they are first. And so, I'm not saying you need to get an MFA or take classes or anything, but certainly, Stephen King's book on writing is a good place to start. And I guess I do have one more piece of advice. Find a writer friend, maybe even two or three, because the exchange of ideas between people who are all on each other's side, the critical eye that your friend can give you, the bouncing back and forth of brainstorming story and character, and all those what if questions that you get to then play with, and certainly the emotional support when things are difficult. All of this is accomplished if you have two or three good writer friends. A really good writer, and even better teaching people how to writer, named Gary Provost is his name. He's unfortunately not around anymore, but he once said that another writer will understand. Sometimes another writer will understand what the rest of the world will not.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's really good advice. I appreciate you sharing that with everyone. One final question from me. Are you looking forward to any projects that are coming out within the next year, whether it's a movie at the theater or a new book that's coming out? Anything that's piqued your interest?
I am very curious to see if they do a good job with the Highlander reboot. I am a big fan of the original Highlander. I loved that movie. Watched it not too long ago, a couple of years or less ago, and it mostly held up. A little bit of 80s camp in there, but outside of that, and it was a movie and an IP that had such incredible promise, and it has probably the worst sequel in the history of movies, and the other sequels weren't a whole lot better. I mean, there's really just one movie in my mind. So if they can do a good job with the reboot and maybe explore that IP a little bit more in a way that works, that'd be exciting. So I'm excited for that.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that is an excellent movie. Clancy Brown is great as the villain. I mean, he's really frightening. And Sean Connery is Sean Connery.
Holy ground, Highlander. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Of course, Clancy Brown's still around. Sean Connery has left us. So if they do replicate that character, it'll have to be a different actor. But I agree with you. It's a very good film. And it is unfortunate that the sequels, and I haven't seen the TV series, but I don't know that it really matches what that original did either.
It's almost its own different beast in a way. I couldn't get too into it. But Clancy Brown is more prolific than people think. He's done so much. He played a cop in a video game called Detroit Becoming Human, I think is the subtitle. It was on like PS5 and it's out on PC now, I think. But he played a grizzled old detective who gets partnered with an android. It's actually kind of Blade Runner-esque in terms of theme. What's sentient life? What's sentient life worth? This kind of stuff. And there's an underpinning of a theme of racism, I think, too, pretty blatantly. But Detroit Becoming Human is what it's called, and he's really good in it. I mean, it's movie level acting in the cutscenes. I played it with my youngest. On the PlayStation, we pass the controller back and forth, that kind of thing, and there's a lot of cutscenes. It's like playing a movie, and he's definitely was the star attraction.
Yeah, he's done some great stuff in horror over the years. He was in Pet Sematary 2, not a great movie, but I think he made it a little bit better with his presence. And he was also in the recent Sleepy Hollow TV series, playing a lawman.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was a show that came out. I guess it's been about 9 or 10 years, so it's not that recent. But he's always good, and when he does horror, he is somebody that really catches our attention. So the new book that Frank has come out with is Kemper's House. Frank, for those who would like to get a copy, maybe a signed copy, what's the best way for them to do it? Which website should they go to? Is it yours? Is it Amazon? What would you say?
I would say franksaverio.com or code4press.com is the best place to go. If they buy it on code4press.com, they can get it for less, and a bigger chunk of the royalty goes to the author. So that's always nice. Same thing for the paperbacks. Signed copy, I would say just reach out to me directly and let's figure something out. I don't have something set up specifically for that at the moment, but it definitely is something that we could figure out. And of course, at the end of the day, it's what's best for the reader. Or, where do you want to get your ebook? Where do you want to get your paperback? It's going to be there wherever you decide it's easiest for you, whether that's Amazon, Kobo, or wherever. The bigger thing I'd say is if you do read it and you like it or you hate it, leave a review, because that helps out the writer and helps out any creative if you leave reviews. But I don't mind getting the occasional bad review if it is a specific one, because if somebody says why they didn't like it, then somebody who feels the same way is not going to buy the book and be disappointed, and somebody who doesn't feel that way might decide to buy the book because they do like what that person didn't like. And so as long as there's details in a negative review, it's not a bad review.
What kind of feedback are you getting for Kemper's House?
It's all been really good so far. A lot of readers have come back with some of those what ifs and what abouts. I'd share a couple, but they'd be pretty big spoilers, so I don't want to do that. But and I thought this was going to be a one-off, and some of the questions that people have asked have made me think that there may come a time where I decide to do some more work in the Kemperverse, I guess.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, Frank, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for spending the better part of the last hour with us. Again, the new book is Kemper's House. Who's the publisher again?
Code 4 Press.
Code 4 Press. And if you want to learn more about this book or any of the other 50-plus novels that Frank has done in a variety of genres, including sci-fi, go to franksaverio.com. And I will spell Saverio for our listeners, Saverio. So franksaverio.com. Frank, thank you very much. It's been great visiting with you. We hope to have you on sometime down the line.
Thanks a ton. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
Very good. Thanks to Frank Saverio, our guest over this past hour. As always, we thank producer and co-host Tracy Asteria. Of course, we thank all of you, faithful listeners, for being with us, joining us in this Museum of the Macabre. And we hope to see you again next time, right here in the Ghostly Gallery.